Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Parsha discussion on Parsha Yitro, which is a very exciting Parsha, filled with lots of great subjects to explore. I felt very drawn to the Ten Commandments this year. I'll be speaking about them at Shul, but I wanted to do a sort of separate dive into them tonight with our group here. And I wanted to spend some time looking at several of the classic Parshanut, some of the medieval commentaries that help us understand Pshat the way that we do today. I took an amazing class when I lived in Israel many, many years ago with a brilliant scholar, Niima Novetsky, and she taught all the Parshanut, and she often said, and I think it's true, that especially in the Orthodox community, our understanding of Pshat is very much informed by Rashi. Whether that's because we read the Parsha each week with Rashi, or that's like what you learn in day school when you're a child, but that actually Parshanut has like a very varied and rich variety of perspectives on any subject. And there were two classes that particularly stood out in my mind, and this was one of them. So I've reproduced it to the best of my ability with some extra little bits and pieces from me. But the text that I want to explore, so it's possibly the longest source sheet I've ever sent at Skokie Valley, but I think it just looks, its bark is worse than its bite here, because the first page is the text from the Ten Commandments, and I think that we need to read through it to really understand the Mefarshim that we're going to look at. And the last page is like a little cheat sheet, crib notes on each of the Mefarshim to figure out what we're looking at. So there are two questions here that I think will help us understand different perspectives, right? The ultimate goal is to figure out what is the purpose of receiving the Torah at Har Sinai. What is the, maybe the goals? What are the goals? What was the experience like? What did we gain from this experience? Because God could have given the Torah in several different ways, and this is the way that God chose. And so I think the two questions that will help us answer that question from each commentary's perspective is one, from whom did we receive the Ten Commandments? From Moshe, or from God, or from some combination, or from some, from Moshe as a translator, or from Moshe as a megaphone? That's question one. In what voice was the Ten Commandments given? And the second question is related, is when were Bnei Israel scared? So a very famous machloket debate between medieval commentaries is whether or not the Torah is written in order, right? So one perspective, that of Rashi, is ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah, that there is no sort of order, and the Torah is written in a way that makes sense for the message or the story that the Torah is telling. And others are much more literal. No, the way that the Torah lays it out is the way that it happens. We might look at that again in terms of the golden calf. Big discussion about sort of what that means, the ramifications of whether it's an order for the building of the Mishkan. But here, right, the question is, at what point in the narrative were we as a people, were we scared? And does it matter? So those are the two questions that we want to read through our first text here with. Who gives the commandments? Like in what person, first person or second person, maybe is the way to think about it. And does that matter? And when were the people scared? So the text starts in Parak Kaf, the 20th chapter, and it says as follows: "V'yidaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ela le'mor." Right? God spoke all these words. So that's like one clue, right? You might think that this indicates all 10 given by God. And in fact, they start in the first person, right? Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord. I'm going to jump around a little. We don't have to read the whole thing out loud. Right? So that's the first commandment. Lo yihye lecha elokim acherim al panai, right? Have no other gods before me. Again, first person. Skipping down into Pasuk Daled here, right? That you shouldn't bow down Lo tishtachaveh lahem v'lo ta'avdeim, ki anochi Hashem Elokecha, because I am the Lord your God. Right, continuing into pasuk Hey, again we see that in the first person, the ohavai ulashomrei mitzvotai, right, my people who love me and keep my commandments. Lo tisa et shem Elokecha lashav, right, here we seem to switch narrator. Now it says you should not take the name of the Lord in vain, right, as opposed to don't take my name in vain, or however you might think about framing that. Right, again, skipping down to pasuk tet, we're talking about Shabbat, right? That v'yom hashvi'i Shabbat laHashem Elokecha. Again, it no longer says v'yom haShabbat li, or for me, or li Hashem Elokecha, but so it's taking out that first person narrative. Then we go through many more where it's just sort of the Lord. We get through all of the commandments at pasuk Yud Daled. So far there's like a mixed first person. It would be easy to say some are God and some are Moshe, because it does seem like all of a sudden the perspective changes. And then in pasuk Yud Daled, it says v'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot ve'et halepidim, right? There's some kinds of crazy thunder and lightning show here. Ve'kol hashofar ve'et hahar ashen, right? Whether probably the mountain is not actually on fire, but like something is sort of smoking there. Vayar ha'am v'yanu'u v'yamdu me'rachok. And when the people saw it, they trembled and they stood afar off. Right, so this seems to be at the end. Some people will understand that it goes in a different place, but this is the text and in which the people are afraid. I apologize that the psukim often seem to run into the words. Vayomru al Moshe, and they said to Moshe, Daber ita imanu v'nishma'a, right? Please, they begged him, use your own voice. This whole show of gods is too scary for us, right? If God continues to talk to us, we will die. So this is where they are scared. And Moshe reassures them. V'yomer Moshe el ha'am al tira'u ki la'avor nasot etchem baha elokim ba'avor tiyeh yirato al pneichem v'yilti techta'u. And Moshe said, fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before you, that ye sin not. I apologize. I don't know where I got this text from originally, not from the New Sefaria translation, right? Don't be afraid, right? God is coming before you, maybe to prevent you from sinning. The Amod ha'amerachok, the people stood from far away. Umoshe nigash el ha'arafel asher sham elokim. But Moshe goes near. So it seems, I would say from the pshat, that the people are not reassured. If we're to read this in order, right? They get the 10 commandments. The people are scared. Moshe says, don't worry. And the people are like, we're okay where we are. Don't make us go any closer. And it's Moshe that is the one who goes up to where Hashem is, Asher Sham HaElokim. So that's as close to sort of the pshat as we could possibly get, although certainly I am a product of the day school system, so Rashi is always heavy in my ears. So we're going to look at Rashi first. So Rashi says all of these words, right? That was the first pasuk that we read, via Deber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ela lemor. And Rashi says, Melamed she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu aseret hadibrot b'dibur echad. Right? This is sort of a fantastical thing that Rashi is saying. Basically, that each commandment came out in one word. God somehow said this magical divine word that humans can't really access. And in that space of that word, he said all 10 commandments. And so then Rashi says, you might have a question here, right? Im kain ma talmud lomar od anochi v'lo yiyeh, right? Then why does the Torah again give the commandments again, right? Anochi Hashem Elokecha v'lo yiyeh od Elokim achirim, right? Because then shechazar v'piresh al kol dibor v'dibor bifnei atzma. So it seems, and maybe we'll read the second Rashi also, but it seems like the answer to the first question for Rashi is that God spoke all 10 of the Aseret HaDibrot, and then maybe God then went back and explained them again. afterwards so that we understood them. Maybe we couldn't understand them all in that one word. I don't know if you've ever seen that commercial about call and collect where they say like, who's the call from? I could see Avery does because he laughed, right? And it's like, it's a baby boy or whatever, the guy says his name is because he doesn't want to have to pay for the collect call. But he wants to tell his whole family about the baby. I see some nods. So hopefully people remember. I always thought it was a funny commercial. And so it kind of like, it reminds me of that. Like God is saying all the commandments in one really long run-on word, and then God goes back and explains them. So then Rashi also addresses the fear, v'yamdu merachok, right? Vayu nirtain la'achorehem shneim asar mil, right? They drew back 12 mils, or as far back as they could get in the camp without leaving the camp. It's a beautiful idea that the ministering angels came and assisted them in order to come back. And so I don't think it's totally clear from here, but I think that Rashi is saying that they left, and why do the angels have to bring them back? Because God is in the middle of giving over the Aseret HaDibrot. For Rashi, who has no chronological order to Tanakh, he believes that the people got scared in the middle, and it was really important for the people to be there. And so the angels had to come and sort of slowly bring them back and say, it's going to be okay. And then the last Rashi to this sort of picture is when it says Moshe Yidaber, when Moshe would speak, and this is actually, sorry, I'm cheating and I went back a little bit, but again, for Rashi, there's no strong order. And it says, Kashaya Moshe Medaber Mashmiya Hadibrot Yisrael, right? When Moshe would speak and make the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, heard to Bnei Israel, Shahare Lo Shamu Mipnei Hagvura, right? Because they actually didn't hear them from the mouth of God. Ela, only Anochi v'lo yelecha, only the first two, right? The Hakadosh Baruch Hu misayehu latit bo koach lihiyot kolo magbir v'nishma. So it turns out, right, that when Rashi was saying up here that the 10 Commandments came out as one, he's not really counting that as God saying them all. And he says Rashi God went back and said the first two, but he did not say the rest of them. What God did is God powered like the megaphone of Moshe's voice so that Moshe could be heard throughout the camp. So far, I'm just going to scroll down to our little cheat sheet here, just to the first, see if I can do it. Yeah, just to the first line, right? So which commandments did Moshe narrate? He narrated the last 8, right? That's according to that last Rashi there, sort of in conjunction with the first Rashi. And these are the commandments that God gave directly were 2. When were Bnei Israel scared? Well, they were scared in the middle. And so I think that what we can understand from Rashi's perspective is, what was the purpose of Har Sinai? It was to hear direct revelation, right? God was planning, it seems, according to Rashi, to say each of the 10. But after 2, Bnei Israel got scared and they walked back. Mm-hmm. And then the angels had to bring them back. And because they were scared, God switches to the megaphone version where Moshe is the one saying things, right? And so I think that there's something really interesting here, right? That the Aseret HaDibrot, the sort of the highest point of our experience with God, is in some ways some kind of b'diavad experience. That we were not able to live up to the plan, the whole 10 from God's mouth experience, and that we had to go to this other sort of more b'diavad experience of Moshe being the megaphone for God, because the voice of God was too powerful for us. I don't know, there's something for me that I never thought about it this way, like when I just learned Rashi, but I think that there's something about that is a little bit sad, right? Like I would have liked either for God's point to be some mix, or for us to have been able to handle the whole thing. But that is, I don't think that's Rashi's perspective. Okay, any thoughts before we move? So now we're going to look at the Ramban.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was wondering, can you really surprise God? Was he surprised that they were so afraid?
It's such a good question, right? What does Rashi mean that it was b'diavad? Couldn't God have foreseen that Bnei Israel would have been scared? it's a great question. I think that it is sort of right, like way bigger than one that we could answer here tonight. But I think that let's keep it on the table, because I think that some of the other Mefarshim might have been, I could imagine that would have been a piece of their choice to go in a different direction, right? That it's sort of uncomfortable. I agree with you to say that God didn't know that something was going to happen and had to switch to a second plan. I think maybe a way of saying it instead is that God only could do the first two because God knew they would be scared, and sure enough they were, and then God brought them back. But that God maybe wished that the people would not have been scared. I don't know. What does it mean for God to wish either, but it's a great question, Sherry.
Okay.
I think so.
What'd you say, Anna?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I was talking to myself.
Oh.
So sorry.
We like to listen to the analog. Now, the Ramban, unlike Rashi, I think he might have gotten paid by the word. Because in all seriousness, he is just a very, very lengthy commentary. So this is sort of the most redlining that I could do to sort of make him fit on a normal size spreadsheet. And the first box of the Ramban is hopefully going to answer question 1, and the second box, question 2. The Ramban is very thorough in proving the point, but I think that we will sort of see it come out again and again anyway. He quotes Rashi, he quotes the Ibn Ezra, who we'll see later. And so that's what all the ellipses are doing, is just trying to take what was like 2.5 pages of text box into, half a page. So what I love about these commentaries, which also I think you don't see when you don't read them all together, is like they are fierce with each other, right? Bivadai, he says, surely. And you can almost hear him saying like, Rashi, you silly guy, whatever polite words he would have used there, words my kids might use. Bivadai shekol aseret hadibrot shamu kol Yisrael mipi Elokim Kipshuto shel katuv. Right? He's saying, look, the text says, God said every word. Of course, Bnei Israel heard every word from God. And we'll see that this is actually very important to the Ramban. It's not just about the text sort of being appropriate, right? He says in the first 2 commandments, the ones that are written totally in the first person, right? B'shnei hadibrot harishonot hayu shomim hadibur umivinin oto mimenu. That for the first 2, Bnei Israel understood the 10 commandments, or the 2 commandments, the same way that Moshe understood them directly from God. And therefore he, God, spoke to them directly in the first person, just as a master speaks to his servant, as I have mentioned before. ומכאן ואילך בשאר הדיברות ישמעו כל הדיבור ולא יבינו אותו. Right? And then the Ramban says, but in the rest of them, they didn't understand them. Of course, they heard them from God. God wanted to give all the commandments to Bnei Israel. That's what God's going to do. But they didn't really understand them. V'yitzarech Moshe letargem lahem kol dibur v'dibur ad sheyavinu oto mimoshe. And Moshe had to explain them until they could understand it the same way that Moshe understood them. And so he says, what was the point of this? Is that the first 2 were supposed to be heard and understood directly by God, because we all should be Nevi'im in these things, right? Moshe is the prophet, the great prophet, but all of us have that role of prophecy. And so I think this is right. This is, again, it's like a textual point, but it's also this immense theological point that the Ramban is making. He's saying, Rashi, you're saying that like Bnei Israel only heard 2 and then they heard 8 from Moshe. No, we are all prophets. So we all have this direct holy communication with God on the mountain. We only understood the first 2 because the first 2 were the most important to understand from God, but we all became this sort of direct line with God, just like Moshe had, for at least a small portion. And I think that is a powerful thing. Like, right, if we stay, in Shul, when we read that Aseret HaDibrot, we stand up and we say all of our neshamot. We're at Har Sinai, and so one of the things we can imagine, or we might want to try to bring up in ourselves, is this feeling that this is a direct communication between God and between us. And we are hearing that maybe filtered through whoever the beautiful laner is in Shul that day, just like Bnei Israel heard it through Moshe. But this is God's voice talking to us, our neshamot, as we stood at Har Sinai. I really like this Rambam. I think it's beautiful. Okay, and then we're jumping forward a little bit, right, for a few psukim, and here the Ramban is trying to walk us through when Bnei Israel were scared. And interestingly, right, the Ramban wants all of this to happen kodem Matan Torah, before Matan Torah happens, because the Ramban wants Bnei Israel to be scared at Matan Torah, right? The fear appeared correct to him, which really him should be capitalized, right? Correct to God. And that, I think is maybe like a more old school version of learning than I'm used to these days, right? But like that, that idea that you should be like scared of the Rebbe or scared of the law professor or whatever, that somehow that fear drives you to learn or to understand things better. Okay, so again, we're just going to jump down here, right? So now compared to Rashi, right, it's really important to the Ramban, even more so than Rashi, to hear direct revelation. And so even though he agrees with Rashi a little bit that Moshe explained the last 8, right, he can't get around the idea that it's third person instead of first person or second person. But he says, no, God gave all the commandments directly. And before we might have been scared, and after when the shofar was blown, but not during. During, like, we had the fear to help us, but it did not get in the way of our ability to listen to the 10 commandments. So now the Rambam, and I love how it's like an unfair thing that they sound so similar and they often disagree with each other. The Rambam has a totally different perspective. Right, he is interested in him here. This him here is Moshe. He's talking here in the Yesodei HaTorah about when and how we chose to believe in Moshe as our prophet and our leader. And so he says, when was that time? Har Sinai. It was when the revelation was at Har Sinai. She'einenu ra'u v'lo zar v'oznenu shamu v'lo acher ha'esh v'hakolot v'halapidim. Right, our eyes saw and our ears heard the fire and thunder and lightning, but who goes into the thick clouds is Moshe, right? And here he quotes the second reading of the Aseret HaDibrot from Devarim, but the same idea that Moshe goes in, right, face to face. Moshe speaks to God. And Moshe is the one who goes up onto the mountain. And so he asks, how is it known that the revelation at Har Sinai alone is proof of the truth of Moshe's prophecy that leaves no shortcoming, right? She'ein bo dofi, that Moshe's prophecy is sort of perfect, right? And he says, again, quoting from right before our pasuk here, he says that it says, Hinei anochi bo elecha ba'av ha'anan, right? God says, I will come before you in a thick cloud, ba'avor yishma ha'am b'divrei imach. Right, that the people will hear me speaking to you. So here, what's the important part of Har Sinai? It has nothing to do actually with our connection to God. It has entirely to do with sort of proving Moshe's connection to God. We are the audience to this divine revelation. We can see and hear, even if we don't get the commands directly, because we want to know, we want the proof that Moshe and God spoke directly, because then they would believe in Moshe forever, right? Beforehand, we see what happens. They constantly are questioning Moshe's judgment, right? About the water, about the quail, about being hungry in the desert. And of course, it happens after as well. But the Rambam is saying that this is like that turning point. Like, oh, wow, Moshe really gets to speak to God directly. Like perhaps we should place our faith or our trust in him, as opposed to always giving him a hard time. It's like if you saw like your teacher with the guru of whatever your teacher was teaching you. If your yoga teacher, you see them with your yoga guru, all of a sudden they raise inestimably in your eyes, right? So for the Rambam, I think that it's interestingly, sorry, why did I skip? He really belongs up there, right? Is that unlike it being about direct revelation, it's to establish Moshe as the Navi, and therefore all the commandments from his perspective are given from Moshe. None of them are given from God directly. So maybe some of them are sort of told over in God's first person narrative, but all of them are only understandable because Moshe is there as an intermediary. So a totally different sort of perspective. All right, so far, I think that we've sort of stayed like pretty much on our first page, right? Meaning this has been about the 10 Commandments and about whether our fear drives us away or enables us to listen more, and who gives which of these 10, which is in and of itself, right? Like a fascinating topic that maybe we could look at Shavuot or Dvarim or some other time. Is it really 10 Commandments? How do we get to 10? Why do we get to 10? But whatever this sort of unit is, that's what we're talking about. And the last two Mefarshim here throw an interesting wrench into that understanding. And again,
before we go on,
please.
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
So it says here, face to face, God spoke to you, but wasn't before the 10 Commandments? Didn't God say to Moshe, "You will never see my face; you will only see my back"? Why is it here face to face?
That is such a good question. We do say that Moshe never saw God's face. We say Moshe saw the back of God's head.
Right.
It's a great question because this is not actually from this week's Parsha. I did not read it in preparation.
I mean, I just thought about it.
It's a great question, Anna.
I wonder if any of the Mefarshim ever talked about that. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, my sense is that it's the face to face is in the Av Ha'anan, in those thick clouds. And so maybe it's like you could imagine God and Moshe being on opposite sides of like an opaque piece of glass. So they're facing, faces looking at one another, but you can't see, but maybe Moshe couldn't see God's face.
Right.
Is maybe the best I could come up with. But I think that you are 100% right, that we generally say Moshe only saw the back of God's mouth. Yeah, Nelson, help me out.
Does God have a face with eyes, ears, nose?
Right. Also, such a fair and important question, right? The anthropomorphism is like meant to help us maybe understand what it means, and really that I think it helps us a lot. As usual, Nelson, you save the day, because right then, what does it mean to speak face to face? Is that there was sort of maybe some direct communication, but it was through this Av Ha'anan. It was through some kind of filter, and when there's no filter, Moshe only gets the sort of around the back, however we say that, derech al gav, right? The sort of runarounds conversation. So either maybe it's direct, face to face, if you were, but with something in between, or it's a little bit less direct, only seeing the back of God is like the way we might say that, as if God had a body, but yes. And I think, for Moshe, right, the 10 Commandments are a whole different game, a whole different experience. I have very much been thinking about it as like what it means for us as nishamot who were there, even if our bodies were not there, what it meant for the bodies who housed our nishamot at that time, or housed their own nishamot at that time. But for Moshe, it was a whole different experience, right? It was solitary. It was probably, it was much closer, right? It was probably far scarier on some level. Thinking about the responsibility, right? Not just to understand for yourself, but to have to help everyone else understand. So it's a great point that Moshe, his experience bears more examination as well. So just to squeeze in this last Rashbam, good, we're not too bad on time here. Rashbam and Ibn Ezra is here. I think that they have an interesting point. to make. And they here, it's very important where the fear comes in. So vayomru al Moshe, that's when they're scared, right? La'achar sheshamru aseret hadivarim, right? So the Rashbam says, after the 10 commandments, sort of the way it's listed out that we read it, right? The first 14 psukim are about the 10 commandments, and then Bnei Israel are scared after them. And when they say, you speak with us, right? Ziber ata imanu, that makes a lot more sense for Rashi if that really happened in the middle, because the people are scared and they say, please, we don't want to hear God giving any more 10 commandments, you give them. And so he says, what does that mean? Right? And so this is that interesting sort of wrinkle, I think. I said that too loud. I woke up my baby. That the Rashbam is introducing an interesting idea that perhaps all of the commandments of the Torah would have been given on Har Sinai amidst the smoke and lightning and thunder if we had not been scared. All 613, right?
Wow.
So firmly we have in our head the Rashi that the 10 commandments is the whole thing. But the Rashbam is saying, well, why? Maybe it was supposed to be more. Now, Sherry, I think that this obviously, your question is even stronger here in some ways. If God wanted to give all 613, why didn't God do that? And if God knew that they would be scared, then why is that even an option, right? There's a hard part here. But I think it's such an interesting idea that maybe this was not just, and it also, again, it goes to that other class that we need to have about why these 10, and are they 10? It sort of takes that away. It just means they were the first 10, right? And maybe those are more important, or maybe that's like the table of contents, right? And the whole Torah would have been sort of organized under those 10. It just opens up a lot of other interesting possibilities to think that perhaps the experience of Har Sinai was meant to be all 613. And here, right, that the Ibn Ezra sort of working in conjunction with that Rashbam is saying, right, they spoke to Moshe, Hem Dibru Imo, Achar Shnishmalu Aseret Hadavarim, that they spoke to him after they were the 10 commandments were completed. And why were they saying that then, right? It's a good question. If you read it in order, if you don't follow Rashi and you think it has to go in order, what are they so worried about? The 10 commandments are over. Oh, it's because Hayu Yiraim ki pachdusha Hashem yidaber odi mahem. Right? They were worried there was more than just 10 and that they were scared. And that's when Moshe says, it's okay, you don't have to be afraid. And here too in Devarim, right, where it's a little bit more explicit, is the same idea, is that Bnei Israel wanted them in between. So here, right, what was the purpose of Har Sinai? Was to hear all 613 mitzvot, and it was just the Aseret HaDibrot that really got said before the people got scared after the 10 commandments. So that was a lot of text, a lot of commentaries. Not a lot of modern commentary, but I think that in their own way, these commentaries, without often explicitly saying it, are really sharing some very meta ideas within the details of these psukim. And that the question of what the purpose of Har Sinai was, and whether it was to hear direct revelation, to sort of walk away with that special connection to God, whether it was to establish Moshe as a Navi, which was really important, right? That seems like a worthy thing to do at that moment, or whether it was actually meant to be a time where God shared all of God's Torah with Bnei Israel, and that it was cut short. I think those are very different feelings of what the experience was. My preference is the Ramban. I like the idea that sort of like Sherry, that God got to do everything God wanted, because it's sort of hard theologically to say otherwise. And that the point was to have this direct revelation, something that we wouldn't have in the same way really ever again. And then to think about how fear feeds into what we get in life, I think is a really interesting idea, right? That for the Ramban, fear does not seem to be such a big problem. They were scared before, they were scared after, but they were still able to hear the Aseret HaDibrot. The Aseret HaDibrot were able to maybe knock the fear into a different place. And for everyone else, the fear is really, well, maybe not the Rambam, but the fear is life-changing, right? If we let that fear push us back 12 mil to the back of the camp, we don't hear the same direct revelation from God that we might have had we not been afraid. And in our lives, we don't always get the chance to sort of redo, right? By the time we come back, by the time the Malachim bring us back to the mountain, God has switched the plan. So I think that if maybe some of these commentaries we're writing in like our more modern language, they might encourage us not to be afraid, right? To take those opportunities for direct revelation wherever we can find them, because we don't want to miss out on that opportunity. And also to think about, following our leaders as if we saw them, ba'av ha'anan, as if we could hear them talking to God. It's not something we get to hear anymore. But what would it mean to have that kind of confidence in a leader? How could a leader show that kind of connection to God today? What is our Har Sinai moment? I don't know. But that when we hear the Aseret HaDibrot in Shul, when we hopefully feel as though we were sort of there, and Hashem would wake us up and say like, hey, we were there, we heard that. I am choosing the Ramban to feel like fear can motivate us to have a stronger connection to God and to have that direct connection. And also to just appreciate the many different avenues of thinking about a text that feels maybe sort of obvious on the surface as one thing, but really could be something else. But I welcome other thoughts, ideas, questions. I can stop the share so we can see each other. It was probably an information overload. Next week, we'll go in some other direction.
Do you think that the Bnei Yisrael was ready to hear 613 mitzvahs? Maybe that would have been way too much at one, it would have been just too overwhelming. So maybe just 10, and didn't they call it the 10 utterances? Why that? Instead of 10 statements, it was called the 10 utterances.
Oh, it's true. I noticed that when I was doing the learning as well, that some people had dibrot and some people had devarim, and that it was not, it wasn't codified as those 2 tablets, that Moshe brought down the mountain at that point, I think. And so, thinking about how it was either, are they all the same sort of types of commandments, or are some of them more utterances of God, right? I am your God, you shall have no other. I think maybe that's a part of it. And I think it's a great point, Anna. So are you saying that like you just don't agree with the Rashbam and the Ibn Ezra? Like there's no way God would have brought all 613?
No,
or maybe it was wise that God changed God's plan.
Yeah, I don't think they were ready for that. That would have been overwhelming. So it was not the right time. That's how I look at it.
I tend to agree with Anna that, in terms of the people having come straight from slavery and only being ready to absorb a certain amount, even if it was a class with a professor, you wouldn't try to pile all the information into the first meeting. You might say, here's what's the important things that we're going to talk about at more length as we go through this together. I don't know. I like Anna's point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
And that way, maybe the 10 Commandments are sort of a table of contents of sorts, right? We'll go into all of these different areas, belief in God, interpersonal relationships, right? As we go through Mishpatim, right? That is ultimately what Mishpatim is definitely an elaboration or an expanding upon. Yeah, it's hard to imagine sitting down for all 613 at one time. Like it's hard to imagine what is the Rashbam or the Ibn Ezra hoping to pull from that? Are they hoping to say that they thought it would be better to have heard all 613 at once, or that it really wasn't better? I think that's an interesting, going to Sherry's question, right? It's an interesting theological question. Why do they think that God intended all 613? Was there a value they saw in it, or just that they don't understand why the people are asking Moshe to say stop if it's over? I don't know.
We'll never know.
I have a theory. I don't think God had the microphone that had speed fast forward like those commercials that give you the traffic reporters speak very fast. I think that when you talk about hearing the commandments or the voice of God is something kind of ineffable that comes to us all at once in a big blow and give us, okay, now you go and digest. May take you 5,783 years for you to digest, and we'll continue to digest. And here we are doing all that, still deciphering what was given at Sinai. Thanks for your part, Yael.
Interesting. I like that. It's kind of a mix of the two.
Yeah, I go with all of the above.
Go ahead.
I'm trying to put words to something here. For one thing, in the text, and you've put this in bold or capitals, that the name that God uses for himself here, for God's self, is the four-letter name, which we tend to associate with the nurturing, loving aspect of God, the Rachamim, as opposed to the more militant Elohim God, which is even known to the non-Israelites. So there's an image here that God is emphasizing. It's repeated 7 times in the passage that you put out here. And what does that mean to the Israelites who've just come out of this very tyrannical situation where all they know is force and aggressive behavior, and to have a different kind of force that's completely overwhelming, but coming from a different place, a different energy? You know, the face-to-face business, I kind of reconcile that in my mind by thinking of God as a powerful energy that communicates at an energy level. I think many of us have experienced this in some capacity. I mean, when you fall in love or you have a crush on somebody, you're aware of this powerful energetic connection that doesn't seem to have any substance, but it completely controls you. So here's this new kind of relationship that maybe they can perceive comes from a totally different direction, and yet with all the commandments that are being thrown at them, or that the perception that to take part in this kind of a relationship, you have to be disciplined and not do things and do other things. It's a big shock. You're free, but you're not free. You're free to serve something much more special is what you're free for. This is a hard concept for anybody to get across. I'm just watching children scramble their way into adulthood. That notion that, you know, leaving childhood and you're going to be independent, but that's not how it is. You have to follow other rules now in order to not just merit, but be able to handle that kind of freedom.
Yeah.
So that's
so in some ways,
I'm going to add one little footnote.
Sure.
The idea of being overwhelmed by a lot of noise and lightning at the foot of a mountain. I lived in Hawaii for a year as a kid. And 2 things stand out in my mind. We didn't actually get to see the volcano, but I saw vivid films of the volcano eruption of 1955. And we visited the volcano 6 months afterwards when it was still smoking and sulfur was in the air, and all of the mouth of the volcano was covered with yellow crystals like Oz because of the sulfur dioxide. So it was really otherworldly. And then at that same year, my class went to visit the newspaper, the Honolulu Star Bulletin. We got to go in the printing room, and all these machines made such a huge, overwhelming noise that covered the whole range of your hearing. And the noise itself, the sound, produced a sort of wall of energy that you felt like you were being mashed, you know. And I found just being there a sort of quasi-erotic experience, all this energy going right through your body. And I kind of imagine that that's how the Israelites felt and had to just walk backwards to get away from all of that pressing against you, even as they're overwhelmed by the emotional implications of a being, a force that had taken them away and yet was now demanding so much of them. You know, the mishmash here.
Thank you for sharing that. That story about Hawaii is so interesting. You know, part of what I hear you saying, Judith, is that even in the 10 Commandments, right, that a small amount of text spoke volumes, right, which is sort of what I was hearing Nelson say also, that it takes a long time to digest even just these 14 psukim, right, that there's so much there. And in some ways, what I hear you saying, which I think is a beautiful point that is not made here, is that the 10 Commandments are maybe not so much about direct revelation or Moshe as you know, orator or Navi, but it's about a transition point from slave to free person, and that's a long transition to chew over in our minds, which I think is also a very valid, you know, role that Har Sinai played for us. So definitely lots of different things to think about as we head into Shabbat and into hearing the Aseret HaDibrot. Thank you guys for sharing this these long chunks of text with me. I thought they were interesting. I'm glad you guys did too. And I will be in Skokie for Shabbat. I hope to see many of you at Shul. And
you'll be giving the drash this Shabbos?
Yes, I will be speaking in Shul on Shabbat day. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as I can in the balmy 40 degrees that Skokie seems to promise this week. So I hope you have a good week, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Can
Thank
I
you.
ask one more question of
Oh,
you?
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this has to do with last week when we did not meet and you
I'm
sent
going to turn off the
sheet.
recording.